What is justice about? Equality, fairness, getting what we deserve, getting what we need. Young's structural approach to justice reflects all of these aspects. In her own words, quote, justice and injustice concern primarily an evaluation of how the institutions of a society work together to produce outcomes that support or minimize the threat of domination and support or minimize one's opportunities to develop and exercise capacities for living a good life as they define it. End quote. And she goes on to say, just a few lines later, social justice concerns the actions of particular individuals on the policies of particular institutions only secondarily, as these contribute to constituting structures that enable and constrain persons, end quote. And that's all on page 7. Social structures are the subject of justice, then, because of the very real impact that the actions of institutions have on enabling or limiting our chances for living well. The concept of justice, what it is, and to what domains of life it applies, is important to moral philosophy and social political thinking. But the concept of justice has a long history and a good bit of debate, not only about the concept itself, but how to evaluate when an action or system is just or unjust. One thing is persistent, though. Justice is essentially connected to living well. This is precisely why issues of human needs and fairness and deserving are all relevant. We recognize the necessary role of having needs met to living well as the role that our choices and actions and their consequences play in our lives and others' ability to live well. Young is working with a concept of justice that includes a mix of concern for what we deserve and what we need. At least when it comes to evaluating folks' misfortunes, we need to recognize that there are bad things happening to people that they do not deserve and that are the result of normal social operations. We call unjust circumstances which, through little to no action on your part, disrupt your possibility for living well when these circumstances needn't be the case. So it's not unjust when someone close to us dies of cancer or diabetes or a freak bus accident. It's not unjust because of the nature of mortality, right? We all will die, and diseases and accidents don't care about what we deserve. But if that cancer was likely caused by a chemical plant pumping out more dangerous gas than they are allowed to, or are not reporting how much they're pumping out, or if we know the plant's emissions are toxic and cancer causing, and yet the EPA either encourages dangerous behavior or fails to take proper actions when they become aware of it, then if a loved one dies of cancer, we call it unjust. Let's take a closer look at the concept, or really concepts, of responsibility. Young calls the liability model the dominant concept of responsibility, understood primarily as culpability, blame, and agent-centered accountability. The liability model, according to Young, quote, seeks causally to connect an agent to a harm in order to assign the agent responsibility for it, end quote. And that's on page 7. She goes on to explain that, quote, this agent can be a collective entity, such as a corporation or a government, but when it is, that entity can be treated as a single agent for the purposes of assigning responsibility, end quote. And that's on pages 8 and 9. The liability model entails the assumption and expectation that there is ultimately one actor or a few actors whose individual choices are fundamentally responsible for the consequences of some event or the circumstances under question. This model of responsibility has 2 additional features worth understanding. First, it is backward-looking. In Young's own words, quote, it reviews the history of events in order to assign responsibility, often for the sake of exacting punishment or compensation, end quote. She states that on page 9. And second, it seeks absolution. Finding someone responsible also functions to absolve other actors from responsibility. The liability model treats legal and moral responsibility as identically structured. And this is why many examples of criminal cases are appropriately relying on this model of responsibility. But some cases and investigations can actually highlight Young's point about structural impact. So let's take a look. The first example we'll look at of how the liability model can fail is the case of Khalif Browder. Khalif was a young black teenager arrested for allegedly stealing a backpack. Because he was unable to make bail, he spent 3 years in prison on Rikers Island without ever going to trial. 2 of those years he spent in solitary confinement. He was released when prosecutors decided they didn't have evidence to prosecute. 2 years later, he died by suicide, and many folks recognize the mental, physical, and sexual abuse he experienced while in prison as significant factors in his depression and ultimately his suicide. When we examine different aspects and factors of the events and experiences in Khalif's life, we can see responsibility isn't easily laid with any one person, institution, or event. For example, the questionable circumstances around his arrest, the previous conviction, he was charged as an adult when he was 16 for crashing a bakery truck while joyriding, meant that he was on probation when charged with with the results of his second arrest, and thus bail was not an option for him, so he had to stay in jail awaiting trial, right? In this case, we see that his right to a speedy trial was violated, as well as we see the burdensome obstacles that can show up when we charge minors as adults. Ultimately, there was not enough evidence to take him for trial for this incident of stealing a backpack, which calls into question why it took 3 years to drop the charges. The abuse he suffered while in jail by both others incarcerated as well as jail guards, and the very real impact that solitary confinement has on one's mental health. And so we also have the opportunity to reflect on the moral question of this as a practice at all, of using solitary at all, let alone using it on a young person. And of course, the fact that all of these individual factors consistently, disproportionately work to constrain young Black folks, men in particular. And so this calls into question other structural problem, i.e. racism, and how the criminal justice system disproportionately locks up Black men and people of color broadly compared to white folks. And so who do we hold accountable or hold account for this injustice that Khalif experienced? The arresting officer who initially told Khalif that he would be able to go home later that night? Do we hold Khalif responsible for joyriding a year earlier, making it so that when he was arrested the second time, he wasn't able able or allowed to pay for bail? The policy of charging minors as adults, making it possible for Khalif as a minor to end up with this kind of a record that gets him stuck in this system. Do we blame the guards or other prisoners attacking him while he was in prison on Rikers Island? Do we blame the practice and effects of solitary confinement or those who confined him? Do we blame the widespread racially biased application of all of these policies and practices? In fact, all of these factors contributed to the unjust reality that Khalif had to live with during these years of his life and eventually led to his suicide. The second example we'll look at is the U.S.'s approach to drugs and international crime organizations and the associated violence and corruption. And this operates with the liability model. So we're looking for the drug lord at the top, but we have a very real problem thinking through the morally relevant connections between that individual and the very real institutions and people that make violent drug gangs all over the world nearly impossible to stymie. The very real institutions and people literally supporting drug gangs who are not themselves gang members. We have a very good example of this in the actions and inactions of London-based bank HSBC from roughly 2010 to 2015. That's not an exact range of years. Their problematic criminal and immoral behavior started before 2010, but this is, like I said, a rough range of 2010 to 2015. HSBC at the institutional level demonstrated greed, neglect, and incompetence that led them to launder billions of dollars from multiple drug cartels. So who is responsible in this case? Is it going to be the CEO of HSBC? They certainly weren't making specific decisions over specific transactions or account holders. The local branches and tellers, they probably experienced a very real threat of violence if they weren't willing to be bought off. Those in charge of reviewing accounts with red flags, they were understaffed. The director who made the call to push through the reviewing, right? They were probably following direct orders or pressured to make it work with the staff they had. We know that we can't stop drug flow and distribution from the bottom up if crime organizations have legal ways to launder money, because institutions are failing to refuse them. But because these banks aren't selling drugs or committing explicitly violent acts, we don't know how to find them morally responsible or accountable in this case. And we fail to find them legally responsible as well. And if this story piqued your interest, you can check out the Netflix show Dirty Money. The episode titled Cartel Bank goes through the HSBC situation. And it could be quite interesting too. But our discussion here is not to say that the liability model isn't important. In fact, Young calls it, quote, an indispensable aspect of moral judgment, end quote. She says that on page 10. But Young's point is that the liability model doesn't help us when we can't find our one bad actor. We use it in situations like the examples I've given to treat an institution as one guilty entity, but attempt to seek retribution or compensations. We don't know how to punish an institution, let alone one where the individual operators who may be making some mistakes aren't individually responsible for the ultimate total outcome. And so we often settle for some kind of compensation, right? We don't know how to punish an institution, so we often settle for some kind of compensation, some sort of money being paid out to a family of a victim or something along these lines. But we also struggle to prove criminal culpability because our legal system is set up for individual-centered responsibility, and it's difficult to prove culpability among structurally connected actors whose individual actions are only a problem because of that action's interactions with other people's actions. But they are not conspiring to perpetuate the ultimate consequences we evaluate as unjust. And so it seems then that we need another approach to, or concept of, responsibility to capture and correct the ways structural injustice occurs and impacts our lives.